This is a story of how I conquered my fears around addiction. Through a bumpy and sometimes harrowing journey, I overcame my fears and developed compassion for my own and others' imperfections. This has opened up space to connect with my son, who is an addict. As a younger person, I was fascinated by the stories of Father Damien and his work with lepers, and Bible stories, particularly the prodigal son, and Jesus' mingling and healing with people on the fringes. I admired and I was curious how some people could devote their lives to easing the suffering of others. I always thought of myself as compassionate. Looking back, though, I see I was compassionate at a distance. I grew up privileged, an upper middle class country club life with an education at a private university. While I contribute money to causes and occasionally my time, I've kept myself detached and safely separate from others' pain. Nowhere was this more evident than in my late relationships with addicts and alcoholics, people I used to judge or pity. I grew up in a family impacted by addiction. The dysfunctional behaviors in my household, such as anger outbursts, controlling, judging, shaming, criticizing, the silent treatment, and unpredictability were scary to me. I could never quite get my bearings. When my life fell apart around 50, with cancer, divorce, and early retirement, I joined a 12-step recovery program and began facing my fears around addiction. I turned my attention away from people I was judging, blaming, and protecting myself from, and focused on healing my own wounds. This started with me accepting my imperfections. This brings me to today's gospel, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. This story suggests that we all have wheat and weeds. The wheat is our essence, who we truly are. The weeds can be thought of as our imperfections, maladaptive behaviors developed to cope with childhood circumstances. In the parable, Jesus encourages us to accept the weeds, to delay judgment even if things look bad. Everyone can redeem themselves, so have faith, compassion, and patience. My 17-year participation in 12-step recovery helped prepare me for life's biggest challenge, my youngest son's drug addiction. While I had been learning to accept my own imperfections, it was quite another thing to accept his. All my fears around addiction were magnified when I learned he is a heroin addict. This seemed like the worst possible thing, and I was embarrassed that it was in my backyard. We have heard that under stress, we fight, flee, or freeze. To say I was scared about my son is an understatement. Typically, my fear responses were flight, ignore, deny, or comfort myself with TV, food, or work, or fight, control, manage, manipulate, nag, or lecture. None of these responses worked. I was motivated to find another way because of my deep love for my son. Could I accept his imperfections and stay connected, even knowing that he could die from an overdose? The journey with my son has been hard and life-changing. I felt despair. I've been humbled, but the gifts have been enormous. I use my learnings to help other people navigate similar journeys. I've learned the meaning of unconditional love. I can fearlessly be with other people's pain and suffering, with compassion and curiosity. I can see through dysfunctional behaviors to a person's essence. and I can hold both the light and the dark, the wheat and the weeds, in myself and others. How did I get here? I couldn't have told you in the beginning because I had no idea how to accept my son and his addiction. As they say in recovery, I just took the next indicated step. And equally important, I set up a strong support system, recovery, self-care, and good friends. As I look back, I see the key was learning to be deeply compassionate with myself and others. Instead of turning away and tuning out, I tuned in, stayed present, and trusted. This led to connection with all parts of myself and others. Studying the work of Gabor Mate, the Canadian physician and addiction expert, gives me, finally, the words to describe the steps I've taken to become fearless around addicts. To sum up his work in my words, he echoes the idea pioneered by Johann Hari that the antidote to addiction is connection. He thinks the road to connection springs from deepening curiosity and compassion. He describes 5 levels of compassion, the first being the kind all mammals share. It's genuine concern for others. I've certainly had this, and it's for me what I've called compassion at a distance. My organic journey to developing the other 4 levels of compassion started with my intention to love my son unconditionally and to have a relationship with him. While I focused on creating this outcome, I also started noticing when I got triggered or very upset by something he was or wasn't doing. Noticing allowed me to choose something different and/or get support. This self-awareness was key to staying resilient on the long and winding road. I didn't start this journey thinking I would become more compassionate because I already thought I was. I started by owning my own addictions and dysfunctional coping behaviors. Over time, I realized we all have addictions. My main one, work, was just socially acceptable. I've accepted that I'm no different than any other addict. We are all, to one degree or another, using something outside ourselves to feel better. We all have wheat and weeds. When I owned my own addictions and coping behaviors, then those in others stopped triggering me as much. Despite the bad news I've heard about my son, including his choice to become homeless for a year, I hold on to the possibility that in any moment in time, he can choose to find his peaceful place in the world. To do this, I first had to believe that I could. And I have turned my life around, because now most of the time, I am peaceful, joy-filled, and light of spirit, regardless of outside circumstances. I also know many people in recovery who have turned wreckage into meaningful lives. So yes, I believe anybody can turn their life around at any time. And that's what I think Jesus is speaking to in the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Be patient. You never know what's around the corner. The door to personal redemption can swing open at any time. Taking the steps I've just described leads me to what Gabor Mate calls the 5th level of compassion. This is when you can fearlessly face pain and suffering without trying to fix it. Only recently do I occupy this place with my son, where I can be with his pain without freaking out, judging it, denying it, ignoring it, or trying to fix it. I'm curious about it. I validate it as his experience. I meet it with compassion so that he can believe he can face it and move beyond shame and guilt. All those years ago, whether Father Damien, Jesus, or the father of the prodigal son, I think I was attracted to their fearless ability to connect with compassion with suffering people on the fringe. While I am nowhere near them, my comfort and ability to be with and connect with people suffering has grown. Over July 4th, I went camping with my son. He's 29 now and in recovery. I'm listening more, and he's opening up to tell me about his pain and life experiences. I can feel the trust and connection growing, adult to adult. I'm getting to know him, and I mean all of him, for the first time. Yes, he has wheat and weeds, and so do I. But if I'd written him off because of my fear around his addictive behaviors, I would have missed the joy of true connection. It does seem like a miracle. It has required faith, trust, humility, self-knowledge, patience, most of all, compassion. I can walk in the world now and be fearlessly present with pain. I no longer need to deny it, avoid it, or fix it. This means that I too can practice easing the suffering of others. And for this, I'm very grateful.